The morning began with a silence that did not belong to a war. It was late April 1945, the kind of gray, exhausted dawn when soldiers no longer asked who was winning. They simply waited for orders, for trucks, for the next hour to pass. At a small British-run POW camp on the outskirts of Munster, a lone guard named Thomas Avery stood beside a barbed wire gate, watching as the last group of German prisoners prepared for repatriation. He had stood there many times before. He had seen bitterness, defiance, numb fear, and the cold resignation of men who had lost everything. But this morning was different. The war was collapsing around them, and both sides felt it in their bones. Papers rustled. Boots scraped across damp gravel. The line of German prisoners moved slowly, each man stepping forward to have his name checked, his fate sealed. Avery had been warned, as every guard was, expect resistance. Expect anger. Expect hatred. After 6 years of killing and loss, no one assumed the final meeting between enemies would be gentle. One man in the line looked unlike the rest. Thin, pale, and carrying a small cloth bag that barely held anything, he stepped forward with surprising steadiness. His uniform hung loose on his shoulders. His eyes were tired, but clear. The clipboard officer read his name, Eric Keller. Avery glanced at him only briefly. Just another prisoner, just another file number. But Keller didn't move on. He paused. He raised his hand slightly, almost uncertain, as if asking permission for a final word. Avery frowned. "Move along," he muttered quietly. But Keller didn't. Instead, he swallowed hard, lifted his chin, and said something no British guard expected to hear, something that made the officer beside Avery look up in confusion. A single sentence. Soft. Careful. Almost fragile. "Thank you for treating us like men." For a moment, the camp froze. The trucks idled. Even the other prisoners turned. Avery stood motionless, as if the earth had tilted beneath him. Hatred was expected. Rage was understandable. But gratitude, real gratitude, was something the war had nearly erased from the world. And in that stunned silence, Avery realized this was not simply a farewell. It was the start of a story buried by war, shame, duty, and the strange humanity that sometimes rose from the ruins. Before that final morning at the repatriation gate, the story of Thomas Avery and Eric Keller had already begun, quietly, almost invisibly, months earlier, in a winter that seemed determined to crush every remaining corner of Europe. It was December 1944 when Avery first arrived at the British camp near Munster. He was 27, a former mechanic who had joined the army not out of patriotism, but because every young man in his village eventually did. His father had served in the Great War and returned with a silence that never left him. His older brother had been lost in North Africa. By the time Avery put on his uniform, he no longer believed war had winners. Only survivors. The camp itself was nothing like the stories that filtered through newspapers or propaganda reels. It was not a place of cruelty, nor a sanctuary. It was simply a holding ground, a cold, fenced-off rectangle of land where men waited, wondered, and tried to predict a future that no longer obeyed reason. The buildings were wooden and thin. The roofs leaked. The stoves barely warmed the rooms. And the prisoners, like the guards, were exhausted shadows of what they had once been. Some were captured soldiers from Normandy, others from the retreat across France, and a few from scattered pockets where German units had fought until they had nothing left to give. Most of them carried the same expression, a hard, defensive stare that warned any guard to keep distance. They followed orders because they had no choice, but inside them simmered a resentment that tasted of humiliation and defeat. Avery knew this resentment well. When he first walked the perimeter, his hand rested tightly on his rifle not because he feared attack, but because he didn't know how to stand near men who had killed friends of his. Yet as days passed, something quietly shifted. He saw how many of the prisoners were barely older than boys. How many coughed through the night. How many stared at the horizon as if waiting for ghosts. The camp's commander insisted on discipline. "Respect is earned by order first," he said. But order didn't erase hunger or frostbite or grief. Avery began noticing the small things. Men sharing scraps of bread even when rations were thin, someone carving a small wooden bird for a younger prisoner, another limping for weeks but refusing to slow the work detail because he knew the others depended on him. One prisoner in particular stood out. Not by voice, not by strength, but by silence. Erich Keller arrived in February 1945, captured along a collapsing stretch of the Rhine. He was 31, a trained draftsman before the war, and carried himself with a quiet restraint that neither challenged nor submitted. He spoke little, worked steadily, kept to himself, but there was something about him that made Avery remember his face. Perhaps it was the way Keller straightened the tools in the workshop even after the guards dismissed the prisoners for the day, or the way he looked at broken machines not with frustration, but with the patience of someone who wanted to understand how they worked. Or maybe it was simply the absence of hatred in his eyes, something rare in those final months. The first time Keller and Avery spoke was over a fallen bicycle. A supply courier had crashed on the gravel, bending the front wheel. The man cursed loudly, and the prisoners nearby stepped back, wary of being blamed. But Keller quietly stepped forward, knelt, and, without permission, began loosening the bolts. Avery approached with cautious irritation. "Did anyone ask you to touch that?" Keller looked up, calm and respectful. "No, sir. But I can fix it." The guard hesitated. Part of him wanted to tell the man to step away, to remind him of the rules. But the courier was glaring impatiently. And Avery, watching Keller's hands move with a craftsman's precision, felt something he couldn't explain, trust, or maybe curiosity. "Fine," he muttered. "Go on." Keller repaired the wheel in minutes. Not a word of pride. Not a hint of defiance. Just quiet skill. After that day, Avery found himself noticing Keller more often. The draftsman repaired broken crates, helped older prisoners carry water, and stayed late to sweep the workshop floor even when nobody watched. Yet he never spoke unless spoken to. And he never asked for anything. Not extra bread, not leniency, not favors. In a place where despair had become routine, his restraint stood out like a small, stubborn ember refusing to die. Winter slowly gave way to the pale mud of spring. Rumors of Germany's collapse seeped through every fence post. Prisoners whispered of home, of families they hadn't heard from, of cities reduced to dust. And through it all, the thin thread between Avery and Keller grew. Not friendship, not exactly understanding, but a fragile recognition that war had placed them on opposite sides of a line neither of them had drawn. By April, the camp officers began preparing repatriation lists. Some prisoners wept. Some laughed. Some feared what awaited them. But Avery sensed something different in Keller. Not hope. Not fear. Something quieter. Acceptance. The kind that comes from a man who has lost nearly everything, yet chooses dignity over bitterness. He would not understand why until the day Keller thanked him. War did not end cleanly in the spring of 1945. It ended in fragments, rumors carried on cold wind, distant artillery fading into memory, orders that changed by the hour. The British camp near Munster felt these tremors long before the prisoners were told anything formally. In March, trucks arrived at irregular times. Officers argued behind closed doors. Guards stayed at their posts longer than usual. Prisoners sensed the shift instantly. Men who had once marched in silence now whispered through the night. They spoke of families fleeing east, of Russian forces crossing borders, of American armor grinding through towns that had stood for centuries. The tension was no longer between British guards and German prisoners. It was inside every man, on both sides of the wire. Avery felt it too. He had been in the army long enough to recognize the scent of uncertainty. One day, he found 3 prisoners quietly burning small papers behind the latrine. Letters, photographs, even a regimental insignia. When he stopped them, one muttered, "No one must find these on us when we go home." Avery confiscated nothing. He simply turned away. The next morning, a new order arrived. All able-bodied prisoners were to assist in expanding the camp's storage sheds. Supplies were pouring in. The camp was preparing for an influx of prisoners from the collapsing Western Front. Keller was assigned to the construction detail. This was when the unspoken thread between him and Avery began to stretch, sometimes in tension, sometimes in fragile understanding. One afternoon, while lifting heavy planks, a younger German prisoner lost his grip and the wood slammed onto Keller's shoulder. He staggered but didn't complain. The other prisoners avoided eye contact, fearing punishment. Avery, watching from the edge of the yard, walked over. "You all right?" he asked. Keller nodded, though pain clearly bit through his jaw. "It will pass." Avery hesitated. The correct military response was simple. Tell him to return to work and move on. But something in Keller's quiet steadiness made that feel wrong. "Sit for a moment," Avery said. "That's an order." Keller's eyes flickered with something like surprise, perhaps even gratitude, but he obeyed. It was a small moment, barely noticeable in the larger chaos of war. Yet it added another layer to a bond neither man acknowledged aloud. As April approached, the prisoners grew restless. Some feared the Allies would punish every German soldier equally. Others believed they would be sent to forced labor for years. A few believed surrender would be safer than returning to a homeland shattered by bombs and starvation. Tension inside the camp sharpened, and small conflicts began to flare. One night, Avery heard shouting from the barracks. When he entered, he found 2 German prisoners pinning another man against a bunk. The victim was trembling, clutching a photograph. Avery stepped in. "What's happening here?" The men hesitated. Finally, one muttered, "He stole from us." "He didn't," a voice replied from behind. Keller stepped from the shadows. "He found bread in the mud near the fence. He shared it. That's all." The accusing prisoners glared defensively. But Keller didn't raise his voice. He simply waited, calm and unwavering. It was the same posture he had used when fixing the bicycle wheel, confident without aggression. Avery separated them, ordering all 3 back to their bunks. As he left the barracks, Keller quietly returned the photograph to the shaken prisoner and sat beside him until the man stopped trembling. Avery saw it all. It surprised him, more than he cared to admit. It forced him to re-evaluate the man he had assumed was simply a quiet, obedient prisoner. Keller was something else, someone who refused to let war strip him of the last pieces of his humanity. Days later, a heavy storm swept across the region. The wind tore section markers off the fence, flooded the lower barracks, and soaked the prisoners' thin bedding. The guards worked through the night to repair the damage. Many prisoners joined silently, unasked, dragging sandbags and clearing debris. Among them was Keller, sleeves rolled up, shivering with cold as he carried soaked straw out of the barracks. When a guard slipped on the muddy slope and fell hard, it was Keller who reached him first. He offered an arm, lifted him up, and supported him until the man regained his footing. The guard stared at him, stunned. Avery saw that too. Small acts. Repeated. Consistent. Each one chipped away at the wall that war had tried to build between enemy and enemy. The war outside was ending fast. American units crossed the Rhine. British forces closed in on the north. The camp commander announced that repatriation processing would begin soon. And this was when the true conflict surfaced, not in gunfire or rebellion, but in the quiet dread of what awaited the prisoners once released. Some feared being labeled traitors if they had surrendered too easily. Others feared returning to cities bombed beyond recognition. Many feared facing families they had failed to protect. In their eyes, repatriation wasn't rescue. It was judgment. One evening, Avery found Keller alone in the workshop, staring at a small wooden carving in his hands, a bird with clipped wings. "You made that?" Avery asked. Keller nodded. "What for?" "A memory," he said softly. "For my son." Avery's breath caught. "You have a son?" "Had," Keller replied. A pause. "He died in 43. Illness. My wife wrote weeks after it happened. The letter found me on the Western Front." The workshop seemed to shrink around them. Avery didn't speak for a long moment. He thought of his own brother, gone in the desert. He thought of his father's silence after the Great War, and of the countless families war had carved pieces out of. Finally, Avery said quietly, "I'm sorry." Keller nodded once, as if acknowledging a truth too heavy to explain. That night, Avery lay awake. Something inside him shifted. Not sympathy, not pity, but a clearer understanding of how much suffering stood on both sides of the wire. And for the first time, he wondered what would happen to men like Keller once they walked out of the camp. 2 days before repatriation, another conflict erupted. One that forced a final test of trust. A rumor spread that a group of prisoners planned to break out. Not to escape the British, but to avoid being sent back to regions now controlled by the Soviet Union. Fear pushed them to desperation. At midnight, Avery and other guards intercepted 2 men near the west fence. It wasn't Keller. He was inside the barracks, trying to calm the others. Avery saw him standing between 2 groups of terrified men, speaking quietly, urging them not to do anything foolish you cannot undo. Keller's role in stopping the breakout was never officially documented. But Avery never forgot it. Because in that moment, even when freedom was inches away, Keller chose responsibility over escape. Duty over fear. Dignity over chaos. And this choice would echo powerfully on the morning of his repatriation. The morning he thanked the guard who had expected hatred. The final day began before sunrise, beneath a sky that looked bruised from the weight of the war ending. Damp mist hung over the camp like a veil, softening the edges of barbed wire and wooden huts. But there was nothing soft about the tension in the air. Every prisoner felt it. Every guard sensed it. Repatriation was supposed to be straightforward: roll call, verification, trucks, departure. But no one pretended it would be simple. These men were returning to a country that no longer resembled the one they left. Some feared judgment. Others feared retribution. For many, the unknown was more terrifying than anything they faced in battle. Avery took his post at the front gate, clipboard in hand. His boots sank slightly in the wet gravel. His breath came out in quick clouds. He kept his expression neutral, the way a soldier should. But his thoughts drifted, to Keller in the workshop, to the carved wooden bird, to the quiet strength in the man's eyes. He wondered whether he would see that same strength today, or whether fear would finally crack through it. The prisoners lined up in rows, their bags small and their shoulders weary. Names were called. Papers stamped. One by one, men stepped forward to reclaim a future they weren't sure still existed. When Keller's row finally approached, Avery stood straighter. Keller walked with calm steps, but his face carried the heavy knowledge of everything waiting beyond the gate. Destruction. Uncertainty. A family he no longer had. A home that might not exist. He stopped in front of Avery. The officer beside Avery scanned the list. Eric Keller, he read aloud. 31. Captured west of the Rhine. Cleared for repatriation. Keller nodded once. No resistance. No questions. Avery extended the clipboard for him to sign. Keller took the pencil, but before writing, he lifted his eyes. What Avery saw in them was not fear, not relief, but a deep, solemn resolve, as though this moment was not just a departure, but a confession. Keller signed his name slowly, carefully, as if imprinting something final into the paper. He handed the clipboard back, bowed his head slightly, and stepped aside to move toward the truck. But he didn't move on. He lingered. Avery frowned. Is there a problem? Keller exhaled, steadying himself. The wind tugged at his thin jacket, revealing the exhausted frame of a man who had carried more than most could bear. He reached into his small cloth bag, pulled something wrapped in fabric, and held it out. Avery hesitated, unsure whether to accept it. Keller lowered his voice. Please, take it. Avery slowly unwrapped the cloth. Inside was the small wooden bird, its wings still carved mid-motion, delicate, imperfect, and undeniably human. Keller's voice trembled, not with weakness but with meaning. I kept it for months. It was the only thing that reminded me of my boy. But I do not want to return home carrying only grief. Avery looked up sharply. Keller, this is your memory. You shouldn't give it away. Keller shook his head. Memories are not objects. They live in us whether we hold something in our hands or not. Then he added, barely above a whisper, you treated us justly. You saw us as men, not enemies. That is why I want you to have it." Avery felt something shift in his chest. Something he had fought against since the day he enlisted. The war had numbed him, hardened him, convinced him that compassion was dangerous. But in Keller's eyes, there was no manipulation, no hidden agenda. Only honesty. The officer beside them cleared his throat impatiently. "Move him along." Keller straightened. "One more thing," he said quietly. Avery braced himself. He had been cursed at before. He had been glared at, spat near, accused of things he had never done. Guards were trained to expect hatred in these moments. But Keller did something no one expected. He stepped back, heels together, and gave a respectful nod, not submissive, not fearful, but dignified. "Thank you," he said, "for treating us like men." It was the same sentence Avery heard earlier, but now, face to face, it hit with full force. The line behind Keller went dead still. Even the trucks rumbled more quietly, as if the war itself paused to listen. Avery swallowed hard. He felt the weight of the bird in his palm, light, fragile, symbolic in a way he couldn't yet understand. For a moment, neither man spoke. This should have been the end. An exchanged farewell. A final nod. A turning point sealed by silence. But something else happened. Something neither of them planned. A commotion erupted near the back of the line. A young German prisoner collapsed, his legs buckling beneath him. Two others tried to lift him, shouting for a guard. The officer hurried forward, irritated. "What now? Get him up." "He can't," someone shouted. "He hasn't eaten in days." Avery instinctively stepped toward the chaos. Before he reached the fallen man, Keller moved first. Swiftly, decisively. He crouched beside the prisoner, lifting his shoulders with surprising strength. "He cannot travel like this," Keller said. "He needs a moment." The officer snapped. "Get back in line. He moves or he stays behind." Keller turned his head sharply. "If he stays, he will die." Avery saw the guard's hand inch toward his baton. The tension was seconds from erupting. Without thinking, Avery stepped between them. "Let him rest," he said firmly. "That's an order." The officer froze, caught off guard by Avery's tone. The prisoners watched in silence. Avery knelt and helped Keller steady the young man. Together, guard and prisoner, they lifted him, supported him, ensured he could stand again. The moment lasted only minutes, but its meaning stretched far beyond the camp. Two men, once enemies, now united in an act of simple humanity. Keller stepped back into the line. He offered Avery one final nod, grateful, respectful, heavy with unspoken truths, and boarded the truck. The engine roared. The prisoners shifted. And as the truck rolled away, Avery stood alone at the gate, holding the little wooden bird and realizing that something unexpected had happened. For the first time since the war began, an enemy had reminded him of what it meant to be human. When the trucks finally disappeared down the dirt road, the camp fell into an unfamiliar quiet. Not the tense silence of war, nor the weary hush of long nights on guard duty. This was something different. A kind of stillness that marked the end of a story no one realized they were part of. Avery remained at the gate long after the last cloud of dust settled. The wooden bird felt strangely heavy in his hand, light enough to break with a single squeeze, yet carved with the care of a father trying to preserve a memory he could not bear to lose. For the first time since he joined the army, Avery did not feel like a guard or a soldier. He felt like a man standing on the edge of something he could not yet name, a grief that wasn't entirely his, a gratitude he hadn't expected to earn, and a weight that came from understanding the true cost of war. In the days that followed, the camp emptied quickly. Orders changed. Tents were taken down. Supplies moved out. The war officially ended, though the world around them remained bruised and trembling. Guards were reassigned or discharged. Avery packed his belongings with mechanical precision, but his mind kept drifting back to that moment at the gate. He thought of Keller stepping onto the truck, not with fear, but with a quiet dignity forged from the very suffering meant to break him. He thought of the young prisoner they helped together. He thought of the men burning their letters behind the latrine, trying to control which parts of themselves survived the war. By the time Avery boarded a transport back to England, he knew that something in him had shifted permanently. You cannot stand face to face with an enemy who thanks you, who trusts you, who gives you the last piece of his personal history, and walk away unchanged. Years later, long after uniforms were boxed away and the world pretended to move on, the wooden bird still sat on a small shelf in Avery's home. Visitors rarely noticed it. Those who did assumed it was a keepsake from childhood or a souvenir carved by a relative. Avery never corrected them. Because how do you explain that the most meaningful object you own was given to you by a man you were meant to guard, a man you were trained to distrust, a man who crossed the invisible line between enemy and human with a simple act of gratitude? He never heard from Keller again. Never knew whether he rebuilt his life, or whether the ruins of his homeland swallowed him like so many others. But sometimes, late in the evening, Avery would sit alone, look at the carved wings, and imagine that somewhere across the channel, another man might be remembering that same moment at the gate. Two men. A war between them. A small gesture that outlasted all of it. And in that fragile silence, Avery understood something he had never grasped on the battlefield. Humanity survives in the spaces where war expects it to die.